Thanks for staying with us. You're welcome back to the morning show here on Arise News. Well, let's jump into it with that conversation on the preponderance of fake products in Nigeria and efforts at strengthening the processes of consumer protection. Our guest is Babatunde Irukera, the Executive Vice Chairman and Chief Executive Officer of Federal Competition and Consumer Protection Commission. Good morning, Mr. Irukera. And compliments of the season. Good to have you in the studio with us.
Good morning. The very same to you. Thank you.
Good morning. Thank you for joining us on the program.
Thank you
for inviting.
All right. Let's talk about what you've been doing for at least 3 years, I believe, consumer protection. I've listened to you on a number of occasions. I've read loads about the things, that you're doing. But, these days, especially lately, there's a growing awareness, which you have also alluded to in one of the interviews that you granted, industry-wide awareness about consumer protection. NAFDAC drew the attention of a lot of Nigerians, lately because of the fake products, drinks, dairy products, etc. Good that NAFDAC is moving in against the perpetrators of things like that. But people are wondering, where's the consumer in all this? Is there a consumer that has stepped forward or will step forward to say, this has affected me badly, this has affected my family badly, and I need your commission to take it up on my behalf? So it's good to have NAFDAC or Standard Organization of Nigeria, take the lead, but where's the consumer in the fight?
Thank you, and that's a good question, and I think you've literally rightly identified the regulatory jurisdictional issues from a standards organization and a NAFDAC standpoint. We are market oriented. We protect consumers, and many times we work from the back end forward, backwards. And so we're resolving a lot of complaints, the periodic complaints about consumers who are dissatisfied with the products that they have purchased or the services they have received, and we're resolving complaints. But it's with respect to fake and substandard goods, there's a little slightly different in the sense that most of the products that are substandard are generally not by the original manufacturer or producer of the product, usually by a criminal enterprise. And so that's a little different. I mean, so take for instance, if somebody buys a bottle or can of carbonated soft drink and they're dissatisfied with it, and we engage the company that purportedly produced it, the first thing they're going to do is conduct an internal investigation, look at the batch number, the production date, and everything, first to determine, and many times we're finding out that it wasn't their product. And so essentially the consumer was scammed. Now, we do quite a number of things. When we see that, we pass it on to SON, NAFDAC, or even sometimes law enforcement. And we've participated in some of the joint operations in closing down businesses. NAFDAC just had a phenomenal exercise in Aba recently where they shut down 240. But I would say, though, that we have a state of emergency with respect to faking products, especially food and drugs. And that's very dangerous. And I think one of the most important components of our work are consumers themselves speaking up. The strongest rights enforcement framework in the world is where the rights holder themselves demand and insist on their rights. And so that it has come, the charter is this high is not because the problem has just arisen. It's just that it's gaining additional focus, and that's one of the most important things that consumers must do, continue to speak up, because it catalyzes even regulators and law enforcement to devise new methods, and we are devising new methods. My first interaction with fake products was far back in 2018 when our own employees at the FCCPC in the South-South zone in Port Harcourt interdicted, about this time of the year, interdicted a truck with fake rice. And ultimately, those my employees ended up in detention.
Fake rice?
Fake rice. Rice that was substandard, was bagged in company names, but wasn't their products. My employees ended up in detention, to show you how powerful.
Really,
you're talking about federal government regulators ending up in detention. And so I spent the whole of Christmas struggling to secure the release of my employees. But after that, what I decided to do was that we would progress this investigation anyway. Spent some time gathering intelligence. We ultimately conducted a raid in the market and in several businesses in Uyo. And the then Controller General of Customs was quite supportive. When I called him, he sent a detachment of armed custom officials from Enugu to drive through the night and meet me at the airport in Uyo because he was concerned about the local operatives. And what we discovered was that these are ships of rice on the high seas. And because you've got, 30-something creeks or whatever the case may be, they have boats go to these ships, unload that rice and coming through the creeks. They won't come in through the regular ports. And some of the people who engage in this are powerful. We conducted that investigation for a while and started prosecuting the people we found, and some of them were important people. Sad to say that the prosecution is still going on since 2019 when we started it. But I have been to Uyo, slow wheel of justice. But I have insisted on going myself that it's not going to go away, and we're still prosecuting those cases. We've taken evidence, we took the companies there, and the individuals are there. They've tried to dismiss the case repeatedly, and they haven't succeeded. I'm hopeful that we would ultimately end this prosecution, and perhaps the judge is minded to impose a very stiff penalty as a deterrent. And so ultimately, I think where we need to go is to continue to conduct these investigations, but perhaps manage the consequence system a little stronger. I mean, if at the end of the day, all you can lose is what? The few bottles of drinks that are on display, it's worth trying again. We really need to make sure that it hits the pocketbooks and takes people's liberties away.
Absolutely. Now, you've talked about the 240 shops in Aba that was closed. We had some arrests in Lagos, and now you're telling us that, you know, there are powerful people behind this sort of, horrible thing that's going on in our economy at this point, because it's not just our economy is affecting, it's also affecting our health. If you consume, bad products, you may die. I'd like to hear if you have some of those testimonies from the consumers at this point. What is it that, people have really complained about in terms of, ingesting fake products?
So typically the most usual complaint is this didn't taste right, or I found sediments or foreign object or microbial activity in. And so for instance, in boxing or bottling a drink, there's good manufacturing practices that ensure the safety and the shelf life of the product. But when that is not done right, if it's not capped right, then you have potential sediments occurring or microbial activity beginning to occur, which sometimes is what you see as coagulation. Sometimes people think they've seen a cockroach in their drink. Many times that's not what it is. It's just that because the storage conditions or packing standards have not been complied with, things are beginning to go bad. And so when we see that, we engage. I must say, though, that sometimes what we've confronted, some of the complaints, don't end up being by some fake manufacturer. Sometimes even the legitimate producers sometimes drop the ball. And so we have to go through a very painstaking process. That's why you have your tracking and tracing. You must have a batch number. And so the first thing we would do is pull that and then say, give us the retained samples, because by law they must retain samples for a certain period of time. And so we check the retained samples. Sometimes we found that the company knew something went wrong, they concealed it from the public, and we're trying to manage it internally, and in those cases we impose a penalty. And then we put them under supervision and watch them and report them to other regulators, like NAFDAC. Other times when they discover it also, sometimes it's a consumer complaint that brings it to the discovery, and that's a systemic failure itself. But when that happens, they must issue a recall. And so then recall. But when we don't know where it came from, all we can do is to just continue to provide that intelligence to law enforcement and other regulators in trying to trace where to find it. And sometimes we succeed. For instance, what happened in Aba was a success, and then sometimes going to Onitsha, and especially in the southeast, that's where, and it's quite dangerous. I mean, you're talking about arriving in a neighborhood where the people who are supposedly selling alcoholic drinks literally go into their stores and bring out their guns. I mean, so you're not talking about just walking in as regulators. You've got to go in with the security operatives and sometimes the military. It's very, very very risky business. When we went in to Uyo, I remember the customs officers showing me a road and saying last week a customs pickup was burnt with customs operatives inside the vehicle. So it's quite dangerous.
I like that you said that we're dealing with a state of emergency when it comes to these fake products because, as you said, it's not just our food, but also our medication. And on social media, somebody whose name kept being brought up was Dr. Dora Akunyili, who, as head of NAFDAC, had the support of the federal government. You know, she had to deal with threats to her life, her children's life. She had to deal with her house being burnt down. So the level of how unsafe it is definitely something that Nigerians are kind of conscious of. But would you say that this government is very supportive of activities to protect customers, to protect consumers, to protect the average person? I know that one way that it can be helpful is in the funding that's given to NAFDAC, is in the funding that's given to the CPC. Do you believe that this government is funding you, supportive of you, and supportive of efforts to protect the Nigerian consumer?
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, we in the FCCPC are self-funded, and so it's not so much, but there's no question about the fact that the government prioritizes this in the roadmap, the governance roadmap. It's identified right there. And before I left Abuja 2 days ago, the last meeting I held with the Minister of Industry, Trade and Investment were two things: how are we going to address this fake and substandard products and inflationary food prices. Those are core issues that it doesn't matter how well we succeed in other things. If we don't succeed in all this, then our scorecard is still not going to show a significant pass. And I know that the Minister of Health is. I spent 3 days in a row speaking with the Director General of SON, speaking with the Director General of NAFDAC. We're convening a joint interagency meeting, an interministerial meeting, and creating a broader task force that would include intel gathering and significant law enforcement. And we're going to have to just, proceed as if we're fighting a war. And my sense of the engagement across the board is that people are focused on this. They consider it very serious. But I'll say again that at the end of the day, government will be what it is, understanding its responsibilities, but there is nothing that catalyzes action more than the consumers themselves speaking up.
Right. I mean, you just mentioned that you are FCPC, you are self-funded. I understand that you have been able to, raise your IGR from about 157 million to about 56 billion within 5 years. How were you able to achieve that, and what can other government agencies learn from that?
And so what it is the CPC, as it was a completely government-funded agency with an average of about 1 billion naira annually in treasury funding, which included payroll. But when I took on the CPC, when I took on leadership there, I believed very strongly that Nigeria was such a large economy and we needed to regulate competition and have more robust provisions to regulate even consumer protection. And so we worked hard at that and got a new piece of legislation. And from the day we operationalized that legislation, one of the things that I thought was that I think that we have a very lazy, nationally lazy approach to regulatory work, in the sense that the regulators leave off either what comes from the government or what comes from industry. I didn't like that. I thought that a consumer protection regulator, and certainly a competition regulator, is a regulator that should facilitate business. For instance, one of the cores of consumer protection is brand protection. If people love a brand, I owe a responsibility to make sure that that brand is not damaged. So I don't want that brand off the shelf. Secondly, a core of competition is putting more people in the space, getting more people to do business. And so, so we approached the market from the standpoint of we don't want anything from anybody. We don't want any partnerships with any businesses. We don't want them to assist us. When I got there, they would approach and say, yeah, we know you need Heloxes, maybe you need tires. I said, no, I don't want anything from any business. I want to be able to hold you accountable when you're wrong. Right. And so I don't need your support. I mean, you have intel about what others are doing, I welcome it. But you're not going to fund my enforcement and help me to go and interdict any illicit products. I'll do my work myself. And just go do your thing. And so we proceeded in that manner and built our investigative capacity. which I think is the most important thing. Because what I found is that the market is really proliferated with all kinds of things, including even the otherwise reputable businesses. And as we built that investigative capacity and intel gathering capacity, we were able to develop theories of what we thought was going on. And so our approach now is, we won't come into your business. We won't ask you to come see us monthly. We don't want to register any of your products. We don't take any approval fees from us. But if we find out you're doing something, we would come. We would investigate. And when you're wrong, and many times when we investigate, the companies always come to speak about the CSR, the corporate social responsibility. And I say, that's very welcome. I like that. But that's aspirational. Nobody can compel you to do that. There's a totally different CSR that I am interested in. And that is a corporate statutory responsibility. And you violate the statute, I'm going to hold you responsible. And so that's where most of our revenue has come from. And businesses understand that, especially the large multinationals, because they're used to those types of regulatory environments in other jurisdictions, especially their home country. And so, and the reason why I can say they understand that is if NAFDAC increases the cost of registering a product, it makes the whole news. Oh, NAFDAC wants to kill business, you want to suppress business, the environment, there's no ease of doing the environment is oppressive. And that's just the rhetoric. But you're not going to hear from any business that FCCPC is mad, it's trying to kill business, look at how much, because they did wrong. When they do wrong, when you've done the very hard work of investigating and confronting them with the evidence, they're minded to pay their penalty instead of being prosecuted. And so my approach to that is, well, I practiced law in the US for about 10 years, and the approach was what you eat is what you kill. And so I've said to us as regulators, we're not here to make money, we're not the revenue, we're not a government funding agency. But in the absence of consequences, people will continue to behave anyhow. And so the IGR is not so much as a mandate. It's not that we have a target. It's because people are doing wrong. I would be happy for our IGR to go down, not because we do less work, but because people violate less.
All right. Give us a bit of clarification as regards moving from being a council to a commission. What additional powers did you derive? And how is that helpful, unlike when you are just a council?
And so in reality, no difference from a nomenclature or from an operationalization standpoint. But the law changed and provided more significant provisions to manage an evolving economy. The Consumer Protection Council Act was in 1992. And you understand the landscape of business has changed between that time. So there were stronger consumer protection provisions that empowered the Commission more. Secondly, the new thing was regulating competition, which is merger control, anti-competitive conduct like monopolies, abuse of dominance, restrictive agreements, all those things that we need to unlock the market so that the small guys don't just barely survive, but they thrive. So everybody can thrive. At the end of the day, a well-regulated market is free and undistorted, and it redounds to the benefit of the consumers. They've got choice, fair prices, quality, and innovation.
Absolutely. Well, I believe it was last week. Let's talk about the aviation sector, where the Minister of Aviation announced that, regulators of that sector are going to begin compelling airlines to pay for, cancelled or delayed flights. Where does FCCPC come in here? Are you privy to how those will be, or how those regulations will be enforced?
So we welcome the Minister's courage. And I think it's been one of the missing pieces in managing the consumer protection framework in aviation. Interestingly, before I took on a role in government, I used to, as counsel, advise the Civil Aviation Authority. So I participated in writing the consumer protection regulations. And one of the biggest challenges that we've had in aviation is that the businesses are able to push back some of the problems to the government and say the infrastructure deficits and all kinds of things. And we have 5 flights going out of Lagos between 6:55 a.m. and 7:05 a.m. The capacity to dispatch each of all those flights on a timely basis doesn't exist. So maybe 4 of those flights arrive in Abuja 25 minutes late. They go late from Abuja and all kinds. And over the course of the day, it becomes 2 hours. But hearing, and so we always have that challenge of finding the right balance. But hearing the aviation minister himself reading the Riot Act and saying we would commit to unlocking whatever your infrastructure challenges are, the parts that we can do, but we would insist that you also, I think that's one of the most important things. I think transparency is because right now it's easy for everybody to be irresponsible and to blame it on a general problem, operational reasons, infrastructure deficits, but just promoting transparency and saying, no, when you're late, we want to know exactly why. Let's get to the bottom of it and let's be able to call you out. I completely agree with that. I have repeatedly said to some of the people in the aviation parastatals that we would at our own cost put boards in the airport. We would do a scorecard for each airline on a weekly basis. All you need to do is give us what time they depart, what time they arrive, and the schedules they're selling. Once we have that, we'll just put it out there. We're not naming or shaming anybody. We're just providing data. And people would be able to see what percentage of timeliness each of these airlines is and decide. If you're going for a meeting in Abuja, you want to make sure you're going with the most reliable airline. And so the rhetoric that it's some operational problem that makes it difficult will be, that transparency would learn. So is everybody experiencing the same operational problem as you or not? Why are they departing and arriving on time and you are not? And when there's an AOG, there's an aircraft on ground, disclose it. Let's know you have a fleet of 20. Let's know that you have 4 on the ground for one problem or the other, so that you don't sell tickets to. So for instance, you have an airline that has 3 or 4 functional aircraft, and you pick up your newspaper or go online and see the schedule is selling. It was going to operate 4 flights to Abuja, 2 to Port Harcourt, 1 to Maiduguri. How are you going to do that? How are you going to do that? We must match the fleets to the schedules they sell. We must not allow airlines to sell tickets on flights that are improbable. And we must look at their redundancy plans. Yes, you have limited capacity, that's understandable. You shouldn't operate beyond your capacity, but by the same token, you must have a redundancy plan. You must have a way to make sure you can manage your schedule when an unexpected event occurs with one of you. I mean, that's what they do abroad also, right? And that's, you can say the scale is large, they have hundreds of aircraft, that's true, but the principle is the same. You can operate an efficiency principle scaled down to the size of your fleet. So I think that's a big thing for us in the airline industry. And of course, the cost of flying is astronomical. And when I spoke last week, he said we're opening a very broad investigation into fares and the cost of flying. And we've been working at this for months. The airline fare industry is one of the most complex to investigate. And you can, and like I said, our role is to facilitate, not impede business. So we can't just say, well, oh my goodness, it's costing 430,000 naira to fly to Owerri. This is too high. The number is high, but determining that it's excessive and unjust takes a process. Same thing, people say, oh, we used to fly to London at $1,000, now it's $4,000. Have to go through a very painstaking process. Revenue management in aviation is complex, and so we have to go through that. It's an area that I'm actually interested in, and we spoke at this one now yesterday, discussed with a guest, when we reviewed, aviation sector for the year. I understand how complex it can be. But from the standpoint of a consumer who needs to be protected, why should the Nigerian consumer who flies airline A, B, or C from Lagos to London, 6 hours, pay twice or thrice the amount that the consumer in Accra or Cotonou will pay? Where's the justification for that? Right, and that's exactly the point I was making, that I share your sentiments, but I would be abusing office to just go ahead and operate based on the sentiments. You must get the empirical evidence. A moment ago, we're talking about why companies pay the penalties we impose on them. It's because they see the evidence. And so, for instance, you know that you can fly on that aircraft from Lagos to London and somebody seated right next to you paid a totally different fare.
That's correct.
So that's because of the management process of revenue in airline. So there are a few features in each market. Let's even talk about the industry-related features. So you've got to look at what equipment are they flying to Accra, what equipment are they flying to Lagos? Different equipments cost different things. Well, how much are they picking fuel in Accra? How much are they picking fuel in Lagos? What are the ground service charges? And by the way, what are the overflight charges? Because then you fly through different countries and different jurisdictions, there are costs to that. And then what kind of tickets do they have? And then then you come to the real economics of it. What's the demand? What's the supply? What's the load factor? How you optimizing? What's equilibrium? And you've got to put all of that into a complete model and matrix. And then we would now be able to say, well, if this company, if Airline A, regularly across the board globally, we see that for the most part, the margin, the business model puts their margin at 40 to 46%, whatever the case may be, without questioning whether that is a fair margin or not. That's not even a question. Now, if the margin on Lagos to London is 500 and something percent, and you must now begin to question that, is this discrimination against passengers from Lagos or not? Are you using what you're making from Lagos to compensate for other routes that you... And so we must develop that evidence. And that's painstaking. A lot of that information is commercially sensitive, and it's not that... I mean, so even if I had people sitting in here just pulling fares on a daily basis, it still won't show you much of anything. As far as evidence goes, you now have to put all of that together, get airline economists to sit, and people who are very experienced in what you call fare building fares and managing airline revenue. And so we're in the process of that. It's very painstaking, it's time-taking, but I'm pretty certain that the outcomes will define where we go from here.
I think one thing I've heard you reiterate today is the importance of consequences. And as a lawyer, you've written regulation even in the aviation industry, and you've also seen even members of your own team being unjustly arrested for doing their job. And you spoke about a case that happened nearly 5 years ago. That's still in the courts right now. What would you expect from the justice system in Nigeria, like the legal justice system, in terms of making sure that there are consequences for these things that we're seeing, that there are consequences, that there are actually punitive measures beyond just fares, right? Because if it's actual criminal elements, then we need the law to step in to protect the people. So what would you expect to see from our justice system, even beyond like justice turning on a very slow wheel? Is there more regulation? Is there more policies?
And so one of the things I think is that the deficiencies in our judicial process, it's not just from the bench. It's both ways. Practicing lawyer myself, and still go to court and a litigator by that, for that matter. And what I've seen in the courts is that the court system has its slowness, infrastructure, courtrooms, the judges have too many cases, having the right judicial support from their clerks, their researchers, and even materials. That exists also. But lawyers must also do some of the work. You must come to court ready. You must build your cases. I mean, and what we have done on our side is to avoid the judicial process as much as we can. We do our cases in such a way that serious businesses when confronted with their wrongdoing would rather avoid. No business wants to go to court unless they think that there is a reasonable expectation that they would win, or they think that they've been unjustly treated. But when they're confronted with the evidence, and I always say that we will stretch this law to its every limit, but we will not cross 1 inch of it. I will not go into a company to run a search without a proper search warrant, but if I have a warrant that allows anything that stands in my way in executing that warrant, I will come against it. We executed a warrant against the company and some of the operatives resisted. We barely started the investigation. I've immediately charged them to court, started prosecuting them. Part of the settlement was to withdraw the charges. And so even, making sure companies behave in an appropriate manner, whether it's with respect to their business or even process, are very important things. So I think we need to do a lot more work from the regulator standpoint, and sometimes from the prosecutor standpoint, in presenting cases that either the targets of investigation prefer not to go to court, or when a judge receives it, is a judicial officer's delight because you've prepared it very well.
Yeah. Well, I'm more interested in this, transparency scorecard that your agency would like to implement for cancelled or delayed flights. I mean, I'm sure no airline would like to cancel or delay flights because there is, cost implications with that. Most of the airlines, they come out with these statements saying operational difficulties is the reasons for their delayed flight. Where does FCCPC come in here in that regard? So
that's the transparency thing. You make a point that, no airline wants to cancel or delay flight. They want to operate those flights. You're right. Those seats on the airplane, on an average lifespan of an airplane is what, 30, 40 years maybe? But each of those seats on each flight is as perishable as bananas. Right. Once that door is closed, you've lost that revenue. And so, yes, you're right. They want to operate those flights. But you know what is even more interesting? More than the airlines, no consumer wants to go up unless they know that everything's good. Even if you have a very safe aircraft, but you have bad weather, and you say when people have boarded the air, say, we've got some bad weather, it's going to be very bumpy, you say, why are you taking off at all? Even though the crew have the assurance that, so consumers also don't want to fly if they're not assured of the highest level of safety. And what I find is passenger aggravation is not when things go wrong. It's really about not believing, they've lost the trust, and they don't know. And that's why I always say that for airlines, if you could just improve on the soft infrastructure of transparency, sensitivity, and responsiveness, we could move significantly. And so if we're going to create this scorecard, like I said, what I would like is for the operational issues, let it be clearer, and we'll put it in the remark side. This is why this didn't operate, this is why this. But to just say operational reasons, you just say, and they even say late arrival of inbound aircraft. What does that even mean? How do you say that you're not operating a flight on time because the aircraft is arriving late? What does that mean? Who held it up?
So what happens in the case where, it's the passenger's fault for the delay? Sometimes some passengers are on the plane and they force the plane,
passengers.
I'm sorry?
Unruly passengers.
Unruly passengers, exactly. And what happens in that regard? Force majeure,
Right, when there's a force majeure, for instance, an aircraft is landing, a bird strikes the windshield and it cracks. You would drive your car even with a broken windshield, right? But the safety rules don't let you operate an aircraft. And so you've got people waiting to board that aircraft, and the aircraft's not going to operate. It becomes a snag that prevents it from operating.
So now you have answered the question. If these operational difficulties are broken down to force majeure, unruly passengers, and what have you, then what?
If it's an unruly passenger situation, there are ways to handle that. And if there's a delay based on that, the record will be there.
Yes, because when the record comes out.
When the record is there will be that remark.
And you have that transparency scorecard, then what?
Right, in which case, then passengers can see. Because passengers,
But then how do we stop that from occurring? Because, we're tired of going to the airport and, waiting in line and to hear that our flights are cancelled when these operational difficulties have not been resolved.
So the scorecard will at least reduce it. Right. It would limit it to real, genuine operational difficulties. Right. So for where it is just a sheer lack of attention or irresponsible operatives of an airline who are not doing their work in a timely manner, you would eliminate that. And who knows, maybe we can reduce this by 40%, by 60%. We don't know. There's no question about the fact that when a legitimate operational reason is the subject of a delay, we're going to live with it. And when that happens, there are other provisions with respect to the delays. Is it refreshment? Is it rebooking? Is it, and sometimes we really can't do anything. One of the biggest solutions, which we can control from our own regulatory standpoint, is airlines coming together to interline. And that means I can get you on my flight, maybe I can get you on this other airline's flight, and then they have a platform for sharing the revenue that comes from that. But that's not what a consumer protection authority can do. That's something the airlines must come together to do. And at best, if there's anyone who can facilitate that, it might probably be the aviation regulator, the civil aviation regulator. So those are discussions that are ongoing. And I think that it has to be the future. Because these airlines are small with few aircraft. If they come together to interline, then I think that we would move forward.
Yeah, it seems like the lack of transparency leads to a lack of trust in the industry and, with people with passengers and consumers. If you're not transparent, we're not going to trust you.
Absolutely.
So, but do you think that this compensation would be passed on if an airline has to start compensating for taking off late? If we take into the Nigerian factor of maybe some bad behaviors or some bad actors, do you believe that this compensation might then be moved on to the customer and we now get even higher fares in the future?
So, and that's why the regulatory ecosystem must be complete. If you have someone really scrutinizing and checking that your prices are fair and all of that, and in any case, competition will do that. If someone doesn't have that many delays and can continue to operate at a fair price, if you want to build the cost of your compensation into your fare, people are going to go fly that other airline so long as they're as efficient. So I think that, the complete ecosystem, everything checks and balances against themselves. The most important thing is we should focus on doing what is absolutely right by consumers.
What do you attribute to airline irresponsibility? I just want to have that understanding. What is it that the airlines do that would make them delay or cancel their flights?
I don't think they're sitting back and not caring and wanting to cancel flights. That much I know. But I strongly believe, personally also, that they haven't mastered the most efficient way to operate. And I agree that the constraints, the environmental constraints, present a difficulty for the highest level of efficiency, but I see other leaks. I mean, even as a traveler myself, I see the interface and the interaction between airline operatives at the check-in counter with consumers. It can improve on that significantly. And you know what? When a consumer already has a good experience with your operatives, they're more minded to exercise patience or forbearance with you when there's a problem. And like you said, if they've come to trust you, you can see each time there's a new airline, everybody starts, that new baby becomes the best of the pack because they're new, they're efficient, they want to gain market share, they're very polite, they're very attentive. And so if we can sustain that kind of behavior all through. And so that's why I say that sometimes it's an efficiency issue. And the efficiency issue is not hardly ever from the very top. It's how to cascade your vision and your culture all the way to the bottom, which again is completely environmental.
Okay, Mr. Irukera, let me get you to talk about something slightly different. Sorry, beg your pardon. Earlier this year, I think it was in March, the Commission sealed a Chinese restaurant that refused to serve non-Chinese in Nigeria, in Lagos. I was fascinated by your intervention because in 2018 or thereabout, we dealt with the same situation in Lagos State. I was Commissioner for Tourism, Arts and Culture. And we discovered that it wasn't just a restaurant. There was also a nightclub involved. Part of the argument was that this is a nightclub for Chinese. And we said there can be a nightclub for Chinese. A nightclub is a nightclub. It is not a guest house. So we got the men of the law, involved and everything. The Nigerian factor, cropped in. And by the time we left government, I didn't have much of follow-up, on it. So I was glad, March this year, when I read that the Commission from consumer protection standpoint, stood firmly for the consumer. It might interest you to know that there is also an hotel, not a guest house, that advertises as a hotel, but then refuses to accept lodging or eating or any of the sort from non-Chinese here in Lagos.
I'd certainly be interested in
here
that.
In Lagos.
And
so,
we would
so
absolutely
I'm interested in how you dealt with the
issue.
issue of the restaurant, and of course I'm sure you can get information on the hotel.
So with those types of things, the law is the law, and people would choose to violate the law, but they should do it at the peril or the risk of what the consequences will be. We have no way of knowing unless somebody brings it to our attention. Recently, the same thing, Asian spas that would not
accept customers.
They do not accept non-Asian custom. Now, and it was ultimately, our guys went in there and they discussed, well, they had barbers, who didn't know how to cut Nigerian hair. That's okay, that's understandable. But what about the nail studio? What about the therapeutic massage and all of that? What has that got to do with the hair texture or anything? And so they changed that. And so if I find out that there's a hotel that discriminates, I mean, the law is pretty clear. You can't discriminate between consumers. Exactly. You know, I mean, beyond being finding that nationalistically offensive, it's a violation of law. It's a violation of law, and wherever we find it, we go there.
Is there any way that they can hide under any law, any diaspora, laws that says, okay, we have a sizable number of our citizens here, and what we are operating is strictly for them, without trying to be offensive to...
You don't want to put that in the public place as a business. I mean, you can have a way you guys can contribute amongst yourself, and this is not a business that's open to people to come and check in. I mean, you have cooperatives. Even in Nigeria, we have cooperatives that determine, we're going to go build an estate for ourselves. And all that. Yeah, there are all kinds of ways of doing that. But you don't open a commercial entity and put it out there on the side of the road and say, no, non-blacks or non-Nigerians not welcome. I mean, this was a subject of tense racial relations years ago in a different country. There's really no reason for you to open a business that is essentially, purportedly open to the public, yet discriminates.
I want to actually ask more about discrimination, because very often now what we see in social media is that some restaurants or some luxury or high-end spaces discriminate against people who they think are not necessarily well-off or wealthy, and they give them arbitrary minimum spends. Is there a way for consumers or the Nigerian public, especially younger people, to be protected from this type of predatory, business activities?
Question. The color of their naira, is it different? You can have certain codes. You can have a dress code, you can have an appearance code. Even that must not be discriminatory. Once anybody complies with that and you open a business to serve the public, be ready for whoever's coming through those doors, or we will close the door. And so if I hear that, if it comes to us, that look, we're going to go to that place. They say no slippers, I'm not wearing slippers. They say they don't want you to dress bare-chested, I'm not bare-chested. I've asked for the menu, I'm going to pay. Damn well, you should be received.
Well, it's been a great year for the FCCPC. Your agency was awarded recently as the Government Agency of the Year. Congratulations.
Thank you.
What are you most proud of?
Well, I am most proud of the fact that Nigeria does have possibilities, and the public service can be an incredibly great place. We've transformed an agency over the past few years without even bringing anybody in. I didn't go in there with a crew of my own, of special advisors or assistants or anything. We worked with the people in there, and we changed a narrative. And I believe we have a model that can also be exemplary. And so that for me is a matter of pride, as it is an encouragement.
All right, Mr. Irukera, before we let you go, I know that you once expressed interest in becoming the governor of your state. Dreams hardly die. Is that dream still alive?
And so fundamentally, just serving on a mass level is all I've spent my entire professional life doing. Whether it's as a private lawyer, suing large companies for what they've done wrong to people, suing Pfizer in Kano, or suing other large companies. And so it was just going to be another platform to serve. So it wouldn't matter to me, honestly. It wouldn't matter whether I'm serving as governor or executive vice chairman of the FCCPC, or by the way, back in the law firm, taking one case at a time, whether it's medical malpractice. And so it's not even on my mind. And so if the circle of fate runs back and presents what seems to be a path for that to be a platform of service, we'll consider it. But for me, fundamentally, it's just an opportunity to, I have fun doing it. I mean, an opportunity to serve, whether in the public space or in the private space.
Great.
Thank you so much.
Maybe speaking to a future governor.
Or a future retiree from the FCCPC.
Would like to thank you very much for joining us on the morning show. Congratulations again.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Good morning.
Right.
And I just want to say, please, before you retire, I have a couple of Instagram vendors to send your way. Thank you very much for the conversation this morning.